Hi, everybody, and welcome back. Today we're going to start talking about Neanderthals. We've worked our way up through our hominin family tree, starting with Sahelanthropus, and now we're going to get to our closest relative. These were so close to us that technically we are not separate species. We'll talk about why that is in upcoming videos. Today's talk is about Neanderthals and their difference from us. They're not very different from us, but there are a few distinctions that we should make. First of all, the type specimen was found in the 1800s, and this is just we call it either a calvarium or a calotte. This is just the top part of the skull. You can see it includes the brow ridge, and even way back then when they were looking at it and they see this big prominent M-shaped brow ridge. By the way, if you see this M shape, it's usually associated with Neanderthals. But they have a very large brain case. It's still low and long compared to ours. Ours is much higher and kind of shorter, but they have this very, very prominent brow ridge. This is what told everybody looking at this that it was in fact not an anatomically modern human. They found it in the Neander River Valley, which a river valley in German is called a Tal. Therefore, in Germany, Neanderthal man, also known as Homo neanderthalensis. That's where it gets its name. Uniquely, we find all of Neanderthals in sort of this swath area along really Central Europe. We see them way over in Eastern Europe, through Central Europe, down even into areas of Iraq and down into the Levant region, and all the way across into Turkey in the Beşiktaş region. These are known Neanderthal sites. There have been quite a few more since this was made, but it shows us kind of the area in which they lived, and it tells us a little bit about why they were living in that area. Well, part of it is that they're very cold adapted. These guys were sort of the poster children for humans following Bergman's rule. They're cold weather adapted. You and I, in fact, all anatomically modern humans are considered Allen's rule. We're tall, thin, and warm weather adapted. We're tropically adapted. These guys were a little bit thicker, shorter, and built for that cold weather. You can see, though, there is a northern edge to their boundary. This is a soft edge. I mean, obviously there may be a couple over here, but what was going on here and why did they stop there? We know there's a southern edge as well, and that makes sense because it was simply too warm for them to be comfortable in these areas. There were areas like the Levant region which are very interesting because there's some overlap where when the warmer years, anatomically modern humans coming out of this area would go up and share some of the caves that these guys were living in before. It was kind of like a timeshare. When it's cold, Neanderthals live here. When it's warm, anatomically moderns live here. So what are their fundamental differences? Well, here we've got an anatomically modern human on the right and a Neanderthal on the left, a typical Neanderthal. What are we looking at? Well, first of all, you'll notice the Neanderthal is much shorter. The average male Neanderthal stood about 5'6", so they're still relatively shorter than us. Females shorter still. But they had a very, very broad, very burly build. These guys had extremely deep muscle attachment points. Here you can see this huge ridge going through their relatively thick humerus, where it shows where the biceps muscle was passing through. All of their muscle attachment points on the skeleton are very robust, very big. They're very heavily built, meaning very muscular. Going along with this, they've got a very broad, big chest. Now, this is different from what we saw with some of the other apes and the earlier hominins, where they have a very large gut. They don't really have a very large gut. What they do have is big breathing capacity, large lungs, large heart, that sort of thing. We call it a large vital capacity. And your first inclination, especially when we're thinking back to anatomically modern humans and how we adapt to our environment. Were these guys living on tops of mountains? No. What they're living in is a very cold environment, yes, but they're also extremely muscular, and there's a good chance that they needed a very large and efficient heart and big lungs and big lung capacity to feed enough oxygen and nutrients to those big, heavy muscles. Why are they built this way? Why are they so Bergman's rule? Well, you've got to consider they're living in the Pleistocene. This is the era prior to our own, which is the Holocene. The Pleistocene is very cold. It is a glacial age. That is, there are glaciers. So, a couple of things come into mind here. Number one, this is what the landscape would have looked like. Very, very large. In fact, we call them megafauna. Big, huge animals. We're talking woolly mammoth, woolly rhino, which are larger than their non-woolly counterparts. In other words, elephants much smaller than the woolly mammoth. Woolly rhino much larger than the modern rhino is today. There were these proto horses running around. They were also very thick, heavily built, and even lions, elk, large animals like that. But you'll notice this area is very similar to the tundra that we see in the northern latitudes these days. That is permafrost, things like that. Obviously, you're not farming those areas. So how are they feeding these big, heavy bodies that they have with the nutrients and proteins that they desperately need? Well, we've been skirting around it for a long time. The closest we got was Homo erectus, who were scavengers. Now we're getting into heavy meat use, high protein. They're feeding those massive muscles, big bodies. There's a reason for that. The reason is they need to A, get enough protein, B, they're cold weather adapted, and C, they're living in a place with large animals that is not conducive to growing a lot of vegetative foods. Most of the plants in this scrub area are going to be short, tough, woody little things like the scrub brush that we see today in the tundra. So they're primarily eating meat. And that means they're hunters. They were probably the best hunters that humanity has ever known. Here we have a comparison of another slight difference between the two. Anatomically modern human up top and Neanderthal down below. The first thing you'll notice probably is the shape of the skull. Our skull, as I mentioned, is much shorter and sort of rounder. Theirs is longer and kind of more sort of along that football shape, although not quite as drastic as what we saw with Homo erectus. They have a long, low cranium, but it's growing up in height. There's a fair amount of height here. They still have a very heavy face. And one of the most drastic, interesting things is look at the nasal aperture, the nose opening. In the anatomically modern human, look at how wide it is in Neanderthal. Well, in anatomically modern humans, if we have wide noses, we tend to have very flat noses. If we have very narrow noses, they tend to be very high noses. If you remember all the way back, we were talking about that is a cold weather adaptation to have a narrow, high nose because it's trying to heat and humidify the air when we breathe it in. Well, Neanderthals' noses have to do the same thing, although we're not sure why this is. But the Neanderthal nose is very unique in that it is extremely wide. But look at this. If we follow these nasals out and this nasal spine out to where they meet, they've got a very projecting nose. It's wide and projecting. That's a huge nose. Why? Why do they have such a massive nose? Speculation varies, but right now the best idea for it is it's a cold weather adaptation associated with feeding a huge lung capacity for huge muscles. That is, they've got to feed those big muscles a lot of oxygen. They've got to suck in a lot of oxygen on each breath, so they need a big, wide nose to do it. but it's cold weather, so they've still got to heat and humidify that air before it goes down to hit the lungs. So they've got a big schnoz to do it with. It's all about real estate. You need a lot of room to heat up and humidify the air enough to make the lungs work efficiently. Here's another aspect, but here we flipped it. Now we've got anatomically modern on the bottom and Neanderthal up top. Again, we're going to see something that we've talked about before. So first of all, we have the long, low cranium. We've got the big brow ridge. We've got the big face. But we've still got big teeth. And what goes along with that? The diminutive jaw, the jaw that's sort of falling away, like what we saw with Homo erectus. Here, with anatomically modern, we have much smaller teeth and a smaller jaw, and we have this protruding chin. This is a Mud1, big male. He's found in the Levant region. You can see the center of his face, right around his nose, has been reconstructed, but we have all the rest. You can see this part here is clay, but all of this, all the way around, even toward the bottom of his nose, this part here is all actual fossil. He was a big, heavily built male. Here we've got a much finer, smaller female. This is Forbes Quarry. That's just her name for where she was found. Amud1 is also named for where he was found. But Forbes Quarry, you can see she's still got this big nose, big, huge center face. In fact, if you look at this face, it looks like you've grabbed onto her nose and pulled it forward. So you see this kind of mid-facial, we call it mid-facial swelling. You see here's her cheekbone, and then it kind of bulges forward into her nose. See how it swings forward into her nose? It looks like I've grabbed onto her nose and pulled, and her whole skull has kind of followed suit. This mid-facial swelling or mid-facial protrusion is another very Neanderthal trait. It's associated with the short, thick, burly build of Neanderthals. So, there are clearly a lot of prejudices about Neanderthals. Why do we think Neanderthals are stupid and big, burly, dumb cavemen? Truth is, we're cavemen today. We still all live in a cave. Granted, most of our caves are artificially produced nowadays. We build houses. But let me tell you, you couldn't even live in a Southern California summer. You couldn't survive it without this house, without shelter. Caves are brilliant shelters. They're fireproof, they're waterproof, they're pre-built, they're windproof, and get a load of this, they're air conditioned. If you dig down, have you guys heard of wine cellars? Well, a wine cellar is such, they dig it down to a certain depth in the area, and that keeps a steady temperature year round. The earth heats and cools everything compared to the surface temperature. So if you dig down maybe 6-7 feet, it drops the temperature down significantly. Basements are always cool, but in the winter, they're warmer. So it's basically air conditioning. And caves are the same way. Caves are nice, cool, comfortable temperature, regardless of what's going on outside. Pretty brilliant. Plus, you can have a fire in your cave. Try that in your Coleman tent. So why do we have these prejudices? Where do they come from? Well, here on the far left, you see an image of what they first thought. This image actually accompanied the newspaper article about the discovery of the original Neanderthal man, and just about all they got right here was the brow ridge. You can see they made him furry, which they weren't. You can see they've got him carrying kind of a big heavy club, and he looks like a big brute, almost ape-like brute. Well, later they kind of amended that. They said no, they wouldn't have had hair. They were much more like us. So then what became popularized, and it became extremely popularized because the World's Fair was held in Paris that year. This is the same year in which the Eiffel Tower was built, by the way. They produced these wonderful full-size, very realistic trio of Neanderthals. Now, these were realistic, yes, but are they right? If you look at the one in the center, it looks imbecilic. It looks really, really dumb. You can see he's got to get this hunched over, hunched back, a fool look. He's clutching that bone as if it's like a baby doll. The female over to his left, you can see she's got her left arm just hanging. They've all three got this bent knee gait, which was actually an assumption that was drawn because the model that they were using it had arthritis, because somebody said he would have had a bent knee gait, meaning the individual, and they took it to mean that all Neanderthals had this kind of bent knee thing going on, like as if they all had arthritis. He also had arthritis in his upper back and neck, so they made them all hunched over like that. But these have a decidedly foolhardy, stupid look to them. And think about it yourself. Have you ever used Neanderthal as a negative remark, as a punitive remark? Like you're trying to find a parking space in the Whole Foods parking lot, and somebody cuts you off or steals your spot. Oh, stupid! And grandma's in the car, so you can't swear. So you go, you dumb Neanderthal. Or probably Neanderthal. By the way, the pronunciation, you can or can't use the TH. It's up to you. Neanderthal, Neanderthal, it all has to do with local dialect pronunciation. So, is this what they look like? A resounding no. Is this what you're thinking when you call somebody a Neanderthal in a pejorative way? Yes. This is what we usually think. Truth is, kinda gonna shock you. In truth, Neanderthals didn't look that way. They looked like this. This is a painting from my friend John Gertie again. That's not what you're thinking when you're calling somebody a Neanderthal. In fact, would you call this guy anything? In public or otherwise? Hell no. You'd look at him and go, yeah, you're right. Okay, there's a lot of things going on here. And I apologize. I don't know why there seems to be this shadow here, you guys. I don't know what's going on there. Okay, seriously. They are heavily muscled. That you can see. You can see he's got a big, heavy, long nose, that brow ridge, the relatively low forehead. But there's some other very important things I want to point out. If you look at a modern human leg, if we bend our leg, put our heel up to our butt, our leg virtually bends in half, doesn't it? Our thigh is about the same length as our lower leg. Look at this guy's proportions. You can see his thigh is longer down to the knee, and his lower legs are short. The same thing's going on with his arms. It's interesting. Why is that? Well, it's because they're cold weather adapted. Remember Bergmann's rule. Bergmann's rule is going to show us that they're going to have short, thick fingers. Sure enough. Short, thick toes. Yep. Shorter distal arms and legs. They're pulling those extremities in. Remember, we're trying to ball that clay up, keep that warmth in the central body. And going along with that, we have broad shoulders, broad hips. Look at this body. This is a perfect Bergmann's rule body. This guy is built for cold weather. This is Milford Wolpoff. He's the guy in the black hat with what I've got to admit is an atrocious reconstruction, and they broke all the rules and it's wrong. But the point was made thusly. This is back in the 80s. Milford thought he was going to wear his winter cap, put the summer cap on the Neanderthal. He taught at the University of Michigan for a long time. And make this image that they put, this made it onto the cover of National Geographic. The point that we're making here is they were very, very much like us. Remember that first image that came out when the Neanderthal was discovered with that big, brutish kind of beast? If you got an Uber and that was the driver, you'd be like, no, swiping left on that one. right? But truth is, here's a better reconstruction. This is a computer-generated reconstruction of a Neanderthal that looks pretty good. I still think the nose is a little small, but let's look at it. First of all, you see that heavy brow ridge. You see that long, low forehead. You see the big nose. And you see that receding chin, don't you? But if we're honest, looking at this, you guys probably just had Thanksgiving with this guy. He looks like Uncle Nate or whatever. If he was driving your Uber, you'd be like, well, yeah, I don't know. Kind of a heavy brow, but so what? He's kind of got a big nose, so what? The point is, you wouldn't run and freak out and get out of the car, right? He's a regular looking guy. In fact, they don't look that dissimilar from us. Yes, they're heavily built. Yes, they're Bergman's rule, but other than that, not that different from us. Which brings us to, are we actually a separate species? The short answer is no, we're not. We know that we interbred with Neanderthals. In fact, probably everybody taking this class has a little bit of Neanderthal in you. That's because our ancestors bred with them. No big deal. In fact, we're probably healthier because of it. But if we share DNA, if we are interbreeding successfully, making babies, remember what we talked about with Haldane's rule and all that crazy stuff we went over in the first unit? Well, the best we can be is considered a subspecies. In other words, they are Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. We are Homo sapiens sapiens, meaning we're the same species. In fact, the subspecies level, you can think of it like, I don't know, breeds of dog, for example. Are breeds of dog different species? Are breeds of cats different species? No. They're the same. They can interbreed. You can have a mutt dog. You can have a mutt cat. In fact, if you want a long-lived pet that's going to be healthy, you want a mutt. Because you don't want that inbreeding that goes along with these quote-unquote pure breeds. Well, same thing with us. We don't want to be inbred, do we? The more diverse our background is, the healthier we are. Remember, survival of the prettiest? So we get a lot of our immunities from them. They get some from us, we got some from them. There are all sorts of physical traits that we share with them. We probably got a little shorter and a little thicker because of interbreeding with them. We got a little more muscular because of interbreeding with them. And here's one that a lot of people are not very comfortable with. We got a lot smarter because of interbreeding with them. You ready for this? Over time, our species, going through all the geni, all the speciations that happened since Sahelanthropus chattensis, our brains have been getting bigger, correct? It's one of our 3 temporal traits. But guess what? These guys not only were bigger and thicker and burlier than us, but they were also smarter. They had a bigger brain than us. Their brain, on average, remember, our brain is bigger than Homo erectus by about 300 cc's, right? They're about 1,000 cc's. We're about 1340 on average. These guys, the Neanderthals, were about 300 cc's larger than us. So, though we feel all superior about our bigger brains than Homo erectus, I'm here to tell you, Neanderthals had a bigger brain than Homo sapiens sapiens. Why? Well, chances are it has more to do with their physical size. They were not taller than us, but they were heavily built. They had bigger bodies, therefore they probably had bigger brains. Also, they're eating a lot of meat, a lot of protein. So they actually had a much higher level of food than most of what we were eating. Therefore, it's possible they were just a smidge smarter than we are. But that's okay. We're doing just fine. And the big question is, well, then why are we still here and why are they gone? Well, the truth is that's not such an easy question to answer because technically they're in us. So they're not fully gone yet. But the rest of that question we'll answer next time when we start talking about what Neanderthals were doing and how they were doing